So I am Dr. Andrea Kita, and today I'm talking to Dr. Kay Turner, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of her projects when it comes to women's altars and COVID memorials. So Kay, do you mind introducing yourself?
No, not at all. I'm Kay Turner, and I'm currently in Austin, Texas, but I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm an adjunct at NYU in performance studies. I was for many years the public folklorist in Brooklyn, and have both an academic and a public folklore background. And I'm currently doing a number of different projects that are always related to folklore, even though they may be slightly aslant. But but that's the way we like our folklore.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, this is great. Well, I was so excited when I saw online that you were starting the COVID Memorial Project, in part because I think like a lot of people, I was feeling like, why aren't we mourning our dead? What's going on? Like, why is there no public moment of silence or any acknowledgement of this? So when I saw that you were doing this, I thought, oh, here's the first thing I've seen that's a public acknowledgement of how many people we've lost. So kind of what inspired you to do that?
Well, the inspiration for it was exactly what you just said. Toward the end of April, middle of April, I was teaching my NYU course, and I was teaching a course called Pedagogies of the Ephemeral. So I had, right before what would have been Easter Passover, I had a class on altars and memorials and ephemerality in relationship to those. And I had my students make some, tentative memorials for COVID. And they did such an amazing job. They really kind of got it in a way. And we had a very deep, kind of class discussion about this very problem that the administration seemed to be hiding, any gesture or failing to make any gesture toward the huge losses that were coming up. And, by that time it was, 50, 60,000. It was just growing every day. And so after that class, I guess, a friend of mine in New York, Jenny Romaine, she's a wonderful artist, has a great theater production company called Great Small Works. She and a number of our other friends in New York we were all having that feeling, just like you were having that feeling. Who knows how many people in the country were having that feeling, in that moment of sort of saying, wait a minute, all these citizens are dying and the administration is not doing anything to recognize that. So it was also coming toward Memorial Day. We were now end of April into the beginning of May. And so this group formed, a loose group of us. It's myself and Elena Martinez, who's also a folklorist at City Lore. Hannah Griff-Slevin came in later on. She's also a folklorist who worked in New York as a folklorist for many, many years too. And then there are other artists and activists who are in the group. So we started our first project in May and made a memorial in each of the 5 boroughs of New York City. And this was kind of a lead up to a vigil that was done on May 20th and 21st, where 10,000 names were read in a 24-hour period. And that project kind of came to an end, but we decided to carry our memorial project forward. So since that time, we've done a nursing home effort, working with a group called the Caring Majority, which works primarily to organize healthcare workers in New York State and in the city especially. And we did a special memorial altar at a park in Manhattan, Madison Square Park, which was a gathering point for those who were going to march in the Fund Excluded Workers protest march, which happened in July. And our memorial altar was kind of stationed right. Everything was aimed at Jeff Bezos's multi-million dollar, apartment, which sits right, on across from the park. And so that was another one. And then in September, one project that I had wanted to bring to our group was this idea of the labor of mourning, which would be a call out to anyone in the country or around the world, anyone to, take the memorial making project for their own, to recognize their own dead. And that's what you participated in with your students, which was really great. And we built a website to help people, in that process with some templates that they could download. And the website is still very active and growing. And there's documentation on the website of different kinds of memorials, different projects of ours. You can see documentation of the Naming the Lost Memorials projects, and it will continue to grow. So I'll just give the website is namingthelost.com/memorials. And if you go to that, you can learn all about how to make your own memorial with our memorial making kit. I mean, this is a way that I have to say, taking folklore to the other side, where you're actually, where you're not just studying what other people do, but you're actually in the process of doing it and really trying to make a case for how important, folk arts really are in terms their systemic value in terms of the way that they lay out, pathways for all of us to follow. It's, there's no need to just group people, in their little silos the way, I think we used to, and the way the world asked us to do for so many years. I mean, this has been very freeing for me. I've always made my own altars at home. And of course, I studied women's home altars. I did a book on that. And, but that was a little bit more on the, intimate personal side, that study. And it was certainly, I would say primarily it was about studying and asking what other women did. And I kind of kept myself out of it. But with this project, it's been very, very good to just, really, bring people to the table of folklore and folk belief and ways that, folk arts intersect our needs, in these very basic ways, especially, one case could be made to say that the very first arts, all the arts start with, the need to remember the dead, that memorial arts are really, sort of in terms of the long bend of history, that's the evidence certainly points to the need that comes to make something that records a death. And so in this, in the era of COVID and in the era of the Trump administration's refusal to acknowledge the dead, it became ever more important for us to, signal the need and fulfill the need in a symbolic way. And this was also, I think, Andrea, and important for me to say, it was very much a project that wanted not to be virtual. It didn't want to go online. It wanted to be in the streets and on the fences and in the homes and in the front yards. There are lots of COVID memorials online. Most city newspapers have done some kind of COVID memorial. The New York Times has one. They're around and they're wonderful. I mean, they serve their own purpose, but you have to go there. You have to go, and you go there alone, in your computer, in the moment where you may find something like that. Whereas a memorial that's actually in real space and time and is made out of something and it expresses the making of it by lots of different people is a whole other thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I liked about doing it myself I like that you used the term labor of mourning, and I know it was because of Labor Day, but the idea that it was a labor. It was because I felt like I had taken this on in some way, that there was, not only did it give me something to do and make me feel like I was active and doing something when in a situation where I can't do anything, but it was a labor. Like I had to physically go there. It was inconvenient. It was, but that's part of what I liked about it, which is so strange to say, but it was, I had to go and take care of it. I had to, because, actually the week that it was here, it rained that entire week. And I was just like, so I'm out there in the rain, making sure that you can still see everything and it's still okay. And I had to go and check on it and take care of it. And there was something that was difficult about it, but also satisfying. And I kind of liked that aspect of it, that it was a labor, and I liked that idea that I labored for the dead. I did something. And I think that's what a lot of us want right now, because we don't always feel like we can do something. And I mean, I've even heard this being said of people we think are doing things, like even doctors and nurses, especially when they're caring for COVID patients. There's not a lot they can do. They can just kind of wait and hope they're okay and intubate them and monitor them, but there's nothing you can do. So I think there's a lot of us feeling that, what do I do kind of thing. And this gave me something to do, which is, and I have tons of things to do, but I wasn't doing anything about COVID. I was doing my own research, which relates to COVID, but I wasn't physically doing anything. And it made me feel like I was doing something.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been, the response. One woman who made a memorial up in Rhode Island, she said that just the feeling of her hands in motion, making the memorial gave her such a different sense of, what she owed, what she owed as a person to all these people who had died. But, if you don't put your hands in motion, there's a good chance that the isolation factor of it all will, it'll keep you pretty hemmed in.
Yeah,
absolutely. So this idea of laboring is exactly right. To labor, and also to labor with others. I mean, our group, we of course have confronted the same things, the rain and, rushing to the memorial to throw the tarp over it and, doing all that kind of stuff. But that's part of the active engagement, of, really tending, all those words that sort of come up that are gardening words and, grave digging words, tending the grave, tending the garden, tending to this terrible time,
Yeah, and it actually, just what you just said reminds me. So my mom goes and takes care of the graves in my family, and she lives, a 9-hour drive away from me. So there's always been that separation between me and my dead. They live someplace else, but she tends, and I would say to her, Mom, like, you're tired at the end of the week and you go and do this and this is exhausting for you. Like, why do you keep doing it? Mm-hmm. And for her, it's a time to be alone with her thoughts. It's a time to pause and reflect. But it's also that tending to the dead and talk. And she talks to them. She takes care of the graves. She has told me that Armor All works really well on graves. If anybody needs that as a tip, that's what she uses Armor All on the graves. She says, it works really well. And now I think with this, I finally understood why she did that. And I was like, oh, okay, I get this now. And it's something when I come home to visit, she always wants me to go with her and do, and I enjoy doing it. And sometimes we do like the picnic thing and, we do all that, but it's funny when you live someplace where your dead aren't there.
Right.
And you don't have anything to kind of to tend. And I've talked to, there's actually some people here that go to cemeteries that have been abandoned. And I live in a place where there's a lot of these random cemeteries because this was all farm country that's been broken up. And there's these little tiny cemeteries just randomly, like alongside the road. And so there's groups that go around and tend to those. And I was like, oh, that's it. I got to go join those groups. That sounds really, there's just something nice about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
so There's something about it that's it's cathartic, and it's, it has this different kind of meaning. But yeah,
Well,
I was.
I think it's part of, a whole other, it's part of a way of, looking at ecology too. The dead are part of our ecology, and capitalism has, stripped that away to make only living living is the goal, consuming is the goal, building is the goal. But, I mean, for many thousands of years before, the introduction of, capitalism as such a widespread ideology and practice everywhere, people they tended the dead as part of the cycle of living, right? So, that was an important, it was not necessarily just an end piece. It was also that you were a part of it as a living person.
Yeah.
So
that's beautiful. I love that. I love the idea of tending to graves as an anti-capitalist act.
There you go.
I love it. That's great.
Good anti-capitalist move.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're right, though, and I think that was part of the reason why I was questioning why my mom did it. I wasn't even thinking about it as capitalism, but I was like, this isn't producing anything.
Right.
And you need rest. And I was worried, of course, as a daughter would be, that she wasn't resting enough, and this was taking too much energy. But now I can see it in a lot of different ways. That's really interesting to think of it that. I was thinking about too, there was one person involved in the project, I think in Oregon, and she had tied ribbons onto, and yes, that was so beautiful. And I thought that one was like, talk about labor.
Right. She really, she sewed each of those and put the name and the death date of each of those people, and she's still doing it. It's an ongoing project. When she photographed where she was at the point that she sent it to me, I think they were at 558 deaths in Oregon, and now they're double that, I think, now. But she continues to do her ribbons. Yeah,
that was so beautiful. I thought that was. I don't know. Something about that one in particular really struck me, and I think it was because of the work, and that it was beautiful.
Yeah.
But that's so much work, and especially now that the numbers are going up so rapidly.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work to continue to do too. But it's one of those things where you want to, and I think another thing that kind of touched me about that one was there's so much of a focus on each individual one. It's more than just reading a name. It's thinking about the life as you do it. And that to me was just really beautiful and a labor, like such a labor.
Right. I mean, I think an underlying principle of our project has been names, not numbers. Numbers are, the numbers are staggering, but they're also dumbfounding. They're incomprehensible. So that anytime you attach a name, an individual, a life, you begin to really realize the cost that really can't be rendered through a numeric.
That's a great point. And I was thinking about that just today, because they were talking about how the COVID deaths just yesterday were basically the same as 9/11, just in one day. And this is ongoing. And I think that
885 yesterday was the number. And the number for 9/11 is something like 2,932. Yeah. Very close.
Very close. And I think that memory too, because I remember 9/11 and I remember where I was and what I was doing and the shock of it. And then to think, wait, that just happened. And it's been happening, and it's going to continue to happen. Yeah. And we're not, how are we not, like, how is the world have not stopped? And it's, and I get that obviously things have to go on. People have to work. There are things that we have to do, like take care of people. But yeah, it's like, it's so shocking and it's so incomprehensible because the numbers are just so big. And then again, not happening other places.
Right.
And that's the other part of it that for me is just so hard to grasp is how have we screwed this up so badly? Right? And then, I mean, and it's a failure of administration, 100%. Because the people that are out there working every day are doing their best. They're people. So this is something from up here, not the people on the ground. And but then we talk so much about personal responsibility when it comes to mask wearing and not going home for the holidays. That's also personal when the issue is systemic and so much bigger.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, true.
Very true. And I think that's what frustrates me as someone that that works with folklore and health, but also dabbles in public health. And
yes.
that this is not, but we see the same thing with other movements though too. We see the same thing with environmentalism, and they keep putting this onus on individuals when the onus needs to be more on the systems and those things.
Agreed.
Yeah. It's I love that though about the project, is that it is trying to make those back to being people, and they're individuals. They're not just numbers. And I think about that.
That is a place where the virtual world can really be linked, to a project like ours, because then you can go into the virtual world and see the stories of, the people who have died. And so and those are very, very moving. And, they're done by family members, and they're, they're obituaries, but they're of a certain kind, because they're just so tragic, the tragedy that's in each of those deaths. And I don't care whether you're 99 or you're 9 years old and die of COVID. Doesn't matter. I mean, that is it's an interception of, a disease at a point of failure by, the powers that be, that put so many people at risk, and many have died as a result. So, it is overwhelming to think about it, but it's, and there's so many, there's so many aspects of this that I want to talk about. But the idea too is it reminded me so much, and I think this parallel's been made a million times by now, but it reminded me so much of HIV/AIDS too, in a lot of different ways. And this not recognizing, this ignoring of it, but also this thing where, there's nothing we can do, when there clearly are things we can do, and that they need to be done systemically. I think there's so many parallels there because of that, that it's a failure of administration, and look at how many lives were lost because of it. Right. This is allowed to just, flow on, that pandemic is not over. There is no vaccine. 40 years later, there still isn't, that kind of effort that was made in the past 9 months. It never showed up for AIDS. And
it never did.
And that's because, the majority of people who got AIDS were considered to be disposable. Period.
Exactly. And I was just about to say the same thing with COVID. It feels the same way.
It does.
We decided that because it's older people, they had a long life. It's like, no, that they, just because you're older doesn't mean you don't have things to offer, and that's capitalism too, right?
That is capitalism to a T, When the worker can't work, they're done. They're done.
That is so, wow. Yeah. It just blows my mind, because I've been thinking about that, of how we've decided that certain people are just disposable. And that's essentially what this is. This is saying that these people don't matter, both with HIV and with COVID, is we've decided these people don't matter. And that's so heartbreaking to me. And I kept thinking about this, especially when the news started to come out that it was especially affecting people of color more than it was people that were white. And I thought, like, the second I heard that, I was like, oh no, we're not going to do anything about it now. We're going to be just like, whatever. Because there's so many people, unfortunately, in the system that just still do not care about people of color. And of course, the reason why it's affecting them is because they're people of color and we don't care about them. It's about the system again, there's nothing specific to if you're Black that it affects you more. Like the disease is not does not know that.
No, but what a brilliant moment for the whole white supremacy thing to be really raised as, as cause.
Yeah.
And, to really start this, very painful but very necessary dialogue about what the system actually perpetuates, right?
Absolutely.
And it perpetuates, as we know, is, ideas about who is worthy and who is not.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, I read, I believe it was Emily Martin, wrote about when she was talking especially about grand rounds with physicians, and regardless of the ethnicity or the gender or anything of the physician, they still compared bodies to white male bodies, no matter what. And that the white male body was sort of the best one, and all other bodies were inferior to it. And I just remember reading that, and this came out a long time ago. I think it was in the 90s. And I was reading that and it was just like, oh my gosh, like I never thought about it. I thought, but it's the training, it's the training that causes that, because I kept thinking, well, it's a good thing that we have, especially in the US, we have a lot of physicians from other places. People come here to train. And so we get a diversity of our physicians, but they're still trained in this system.
Yeah.
And they still end up comparing bodies to that white male body. And of course, we do this with disability too. We have this pretend notion of health that no one can ever reach, right? It's all the way up here.
No one can ever, no, I know.
And none of us are ever healthy by that standard,
no,
right?
That's exactly right. No.
Yeah, and I was just talking about this with some of my students the other day too, that I was saying, there used to be, especially if you look folklorically at the different ways that we've talked about bodies, if we look at folk tales, if we look at all these things, there's a real diversity of bodies there.
Yeah.
To the point where it wasn't even really something you commented on. It was that's just the way it is. And I was talking about how every time I teach, usually my sort of introduction to folklore class, I read the ending to the Grimm's Cinderella to them. And they're always shocked, of course, because they're used to the Disney version, and there's all these cutting off of feet and all this stuff happening.
Right.
But the thing that always shocks them the most is there's this line where one of the sisters says, and I think the word they use in the Grimm's translation that I have is deformed, that you don't want to see Cinderella she's disabled in some sort of way. And all my students are like, wait, what? And like, that's the part. I'm like, I'm sorry, but like, we were cutting off feet and everything, and birds are pecking out eyes, and that's what you want to focus on? All right. Because their notion of Cinderella is that she's beautiful and perfect, right? And this idea that she might not have been, and that the prince found her attractive, is so out for them that they can't even comprehend it. And so,
I mean, if you think about Cinderella for one, she's malnourished. She probably started out that she probably has rickets and a bunch of other stuff going on. Plus she's been bent over in the, sweeping those ashes. I don't know. It's hard to imagine that she could get away with the whole transformation, right?
Right, and that's like what we see in like every movie when they do the makeover. It's like they just stick glasses on her and then take the glasses off and she's suddenly beautiful. And it's like the same thing with Cinderella. It's like, no, she probably was hunched over and probably had a bad back and like,
definitely a bad back.
For sure. I'm sure her hands probably look terrible too. Like she wasn't wearing gloves. But it's so funny that they have this, and I try to tell them like, yes, this is shattering your ideals of all these things. And, I get accused of ruining childhoods.
Of course.
but I'm like, but isn't that good to know that the perfection doesn't exist? Like you're trying to go for this ideal that doesn't exist, not even in fairy tales.
Right.
And so like they kind of have a moment then, but I think that really kind of speaks to how we're so far from, we are individually all so far from the ideal body, but yet we still hold this notion of ideal body, and we're all working towards this ideal body that doesn't exist. And honestly, if you reach it, it isn't healthy. It's, and I talked to my students, this too. If you look at, like, we think of Olympians as being sort of ideal body, right? They're so good. They're at the top of their field. I'm like, most of them have such little body fat that they can't menstruate anymore. Like that's not. They're not reproductively viable.
They're in shutdown.
Yeah, I'm like, so your ideal body is not reproductively viable anymore. Like that's not good.
That's not healthy.
Yeah, that's not healthy. And so, it is a kind of a wake up call, I think, for some of them, but it's an interesting idea to think about.
Yeah.
As we think about COVID too, because this is another thing that keeps coming up is this is a virus, and viruses can stay in the body and reappear later, like chickenpox with shingles. And we don't know what that's going to be.
Right.
So that's something that we're not talking about as well. I think some people are talking about it, but a lot of people have this.
Yeah, and it's looking like a very stealth virus. I mean, it has a lot of ideas. It's got it moves very insidiously, and it gathers information as it goes through our systems, to find more ways to replicate, find more, sort of little hiding places, all this stuff that, came out later about blood clots and, brain hemorrhaging and, all this stuff, the COVID toes, it's just, I can't believe that it won't be with us for a long time.
Exactly.
And
we know that there are people, the long haulers that have had ongoing problems, but I'm also wondering, is it going to surface again later in life and cause future problems? That's, and I remember too, at one point when Ebola was big, I remember telling my students, like, Ebola is not it's not a good virus because it kills its host. And from the virus perspective, what the virus wants to do is live in you as long as possible and spread as far as it can. And they were so focused on Ebola because of the deaths. And I was like, but Ebola is going to be contained because it kills its host. It's from the virus perspective, not successful from the virus perspective.
Right. It's not as successful.
This is a successful virus.
Very successful.
And it seems like that's not something that we should be afraid of, because people are like, oh, you just get sick for a little bit and you'll be fine. It's like, oh, but is that going to be the way it is?
Right.
So I wonder what that future is going to be like as well.
I do too. Too. All these, the whole issue around herd immunity, around community spread, all of that, the ways that we don't understand how this virus is still moving through populations is really very unhappy making, in terms of just feeling like at this point, now we knew the fall was going to be bad. Anyone who had a brain knew that it was going to be bad, and it's bad. It's really bad because it's, everywhere, but it's also everywhere because people, the fatigue really did start to set in. The politics about masking were absolutely beyond the pale, no other country politicized mask wearing except the US, no other country. And that killed a lot of people. That, that very issue has brought death with it, So.
And I think about that because, like you said, we're the only country that have made this a political issue, but we're just not good as Americans of thinking about taking care of others.
Yes, I agree. This was a real wake-up call around that. We have an idea of ourselves as being very caring and empathetic, but it's really just an idea. When it comes down to it, it's, my rights, right or wrong. And, and that so forcefully.
It really did.
It really did, that people did not want to, they didn't want the science. They didn't care about their neighbor,
Yeah, that is so hard to think about. Hard. It is. It's really Yeah, it's really difficult. I was also going to ask you too about you've been involved with folklore and advocacy for a long time, and
Mm.
I love that. And and I think there's still debates though in our discipline of should we be advocates? And I was
Right.
wondering what you thought about that. I mean, I think you're pro, but
Yeah, I'm pretty pro. I think that in the history of the discipline, the split between public folklore and academic folklore was an old wound that, that to a certain extent, got the scar tissue kind of covered it over, but it always kind of would come back around. And one way that it would come back would be around issues of advocacy, because there would be people who would say in those, I remember the business meetings when we wanted to, against the Iraq War in 2002, the business meeting, I think Sue Elaturio led the charge, and it was, but a lot of people stood up against it. No, we don't do that. We remain, pristine and sort of neutral, and and neutrality is worth protecting. There were a lot of people who felt that way when the Iraq War came up. So I think that slowly, though, over this past 20 years, as things have really shifted, and as we have a younger population of folklorists coming in who are already there. They don't need to be brought to advocacy. They're already advocates, and that's one of the reasons they want to do folklore. That's like, it's not a second thought for them or a third thought. It's, it's up there, driving the very reason that they want to do the research or the public folklore or whatever. So I think the discipline is shifting by virtue of the population that is coming in to take the profession on, and also that we're also finding that our alliances now are shifting as well. So, Black Lives Matter, or, excluded workers, or, those kinds of groups are the groups that folklorists want to be involved with now, want to attach to, study, help, because that's where, to a certain extent, the culture is also evolving. The anti-racist culture is evolving in Black Lives Matter. And so I think that, there are also really interesting things to study now that kind of weren't around, 25, 30 years ago. And as I was saying before, I do think that, my training was much more siloed. You had to make a choice. You couldn't be an academic and a public folklorist. I mean, I kind of did that by virtue of, needing money. Part of it was, when I decided that academic folklore was not what I wanted to do, and public folklore was a part of what I was already doing, and that we were here in Texas doing Texas folk life, creating that entity. That was so exciting to me. That was like, it was a creative activity that, that was very, very satisfying. So I think the creation of, that period of the 80s was very creative in folklore. The creation of nonprofit folklore standalones they're still active. Vermont Folklife Center, City Lore, Texas Folklife, ACTA in California, Western Folklife, all of those that came up it was like a real blossoming. And so we do go through, we go through these blossoming periods in folklore. And I don't think that happens in like English lit, the blossoming, I guess what happens in English lit is that, new theories come into play. Mm-hmm. Queer theory comes into English literature and really shifts the way that people think about, characters or the history of a certain, literary form or a genre, or, or an artist, a Shakespeare or a whoever, right? So, yeah, so those things definitely happen. But I think in folklore, it's just, we also are just, we're attuned to cultural shifts and to the value of those shifts. And I think that folklorists kind of want to be at the place where that kind of stuff is happening. So so I'm very happy with the way the discipline is moving now. I think it's academically as rigorous as it's ever been. I think new sort of one thing that I advocated for by starting this curriculum opportunities committee as part of my presidency was, we have a lot to offer queer theory and feminist theory and disability theory, just as they have a lot to offer us, and we have to buck up our academic syllabi and get some of this stuff in there so that these discourses can speak to each other. Because I mean, honestly, anytime I teach folklore in performance studies at NYU, the students just go, they go crazy for it. They love it. But they have no idea that a lot of times they don't have any idea that it is what it is, right?
Yeah, and I do think that's true, that we need to be better at advocating for ourselves too, because we have so much to offer other disciplines. Yeah. And that's what I think is always so interesting to me is, I'll talk to one of my colleagues because I'm in an English department. And like, I remember a couple of years ago, some of my students were also taking a class in queer theory. And they're like, this class, like this, and I think it was my supernatural class. They're like, supernatural and queer theory have so much in common. And I was like, yes, they do, Right. And they were so excited about it. And then and that turned into, a few theses and, some other developments. And I was like, this is great. Like, this is exactly what I want. And I actually remember this great thesis that I was director of, and it was a queer theory one that brought in witches, and it was amazing. It was looking at proper representations of witches. My student Caitlin came up with it. And at one point, somebody else, they were like, well, how do you... Yeah, right? Yeah. And at one point, someone had asked her in the defense, they were like, well, how do you know if you're a witch? And she's like, well, it's kind of like, how do you know if you're gay? You just know you're one. And I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. That's great. And I was like, that's just so fantastic, because that's like just another example of how these two things kind of go along together. It's like, well, you just know, like one day you sort of start to figure it out. And I thought that was so great.
That's the kind of student that, Caitlin is a good example of the kind of student that we have in, coming into folklore now, that they accept certain realities. They've processed a lot in their growing up and around, queerness. These younger, 20 and 30-year-olds, they've already processed all of that. They are fully in the, they're already got their fairy shoes. They're already wearing them,
Yeah. Well, it's so funny too, because I was talking with one of my friends that does a lot of research in mentorship. And she was talking about having young mentors, like that every person should have a mentor or someone that's younger. Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that, but I have them, because I have the younger generation of folklorists that I'm constantly like, I'm following them on social media and I'm watching what they're doing. And I'm like, yes, guys, yes. I'm so excited and proud of them, because they're so far. They're not even having these discussions anymore. They're past that. Right. And I love that. Because I remember actually when I was in grad school at Western Kentucky, and I would learn that there had been a split between academic and public folklore. And I remember thinking, like, that's dumb. Why did that exist? And I was like, I was past that. And I think my professors were excited to see that I was past that. And now I'm excited to see that they're past a lot of these other things. And, I think that's what's so great about that notion of having younger people also mentor older people and teaching us and showing us the way. No, we don't need to have that discussion anymore. We're done. We're on to this next thing. Right. And I love that. I love that about that. And that's what I love about conferences too, is going to them and hearing what they have to say. And then I come in with my stuff from like, oh, I should read this stuff from the 70s and 80s and 90s. And
they're like, really?
Yeah, really? Oh no, that's gross. But yeah, but there is, and I do think I am one of those people that I think I still have my touchstones where I go back to certain things, and
Yes,
of
I course. I do too.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's so exciting to see all this new information and these new things. I just wish I had infinite time to read it all. But that was one thing I think as a professor, I thought I'd have time to read, and you don't.
Oh, you got a lot going on, Andrea.
That's true.
This
has been a very busy time for me.
Yeah. Yep. It
Yeah.
seems
So
yeah.
it's definitely been busy, but in a good way.
So you're really getting, I mean, I love this project, getting out there, having these conversations that are very fluid. This has been a great conversation today, really, I mean, for me, just it always helps me, sort of in talking to someone like you, a colleague, a friend, you start, the ideas start rolling, into each other, and you start to see these connections that are really, really critical, and that I think this is the kind of conversation that folklorists have with each other.
Exactly.
It's not the kind of conversation that other kinds of researchers and academics and people in the public eye, this is not their conversation. This is our conversation, but it's our conversation to bring, and so the way that you're bringing it, I think, is very cool. Super cool.
This is what I always tell people about folklore is if you don't know something, or you're like, oh, there's got to be somebody that wrote about this, just go ask a folklorist, because they're going to know, they're going to know, they're going to know something about it, or they're going to know the person who knows. And it's weird how we do that. And I've realized that even in my department, that a lot of times, both in the past with past chairs and even currently, when we're sort of lost on, like, someone has approached us about something, it's like, well, I don't know about this. So we're like, oh, ask Andrea. Andrea will know somebody. It's like, oh, it's because I'm a folklorist. That's why. It's not because I'm special or unique. I'm just a folklorist. So
I have friends like that too. They're like, go ask Kay. She knows everything. She knows about all kinds of weird stuff. But you know what I tell them? I go, you know what? I got the tree of life down. The roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. And, it's all there. And, you just pluck from it. You just pluck.
I love that.
From the tree of life. And that's what, folklore gives you access to, that entire tree and all the branches as they're swaying together and, crashing down, and the leaves are blowing off and the roots are uprooting the earth around them, but that tree is the thing. It's the thing that holds the tree of knowledge, the fucking tree of knowledge, right?
I love it. I love that as an analogy. That is so great, because that's exactly what I feel like. And that's what I try to explain to my students too. I'm like, folklore is like, it's the methodology, it's the knowing how to do things.
Right.
And then you could apply it to everything. Right. And I was giving a lecture yesterday. I'm working with this art project in Ireland called the Day of Straws. And I was talking about this, and they were like, everything's folklore. And I'm like, yes, it is. I'm like, it's just all in how you approach it. That's exactly it. And I always tell my students, because my students have that moment too. They're like, what isn't folklore? And I'm like, okay, let's talk. Like, now we're going to start unpacking. But it is. It's
industrial cleaners.
Yeah. But yeah, it is.
But don't, don't hold me to it. There might be a culture of industrial cleaners that someone needs to know.
Maybe there could be. Yeah. That's absolutely true. You never know. But that's what's so cool about what we do, is that it's all of these things that are possible with this discipline, and all the things we can learn. And I do, like, there's so many times too, especially when I'm talking to colleagues, that they'll talk about what they're doing in their discipline right now. And I'll sit in the back of my head and think, folklorists did that 20 years ago. Like, catch up.
Yes.
And that's why I think it's also so sad that more people don't know about us, is because I feel like we could save them some time. And I think we can all move forward together, right? I don't think this is a competition. So, we could save people time if they read our old stuff, what we're doing right now.
I totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, a lot of, the humanities are under great stress, as we all know, and they are trying to, find ways to, to move their PhDs out into the world without necessarily being able to promise an academic position. So, we did this thing at MLA a few years ago on, public folklore and ways that the folklore discipline has kind of had this history of, taking the whole, looking at the whole piece of what we do, and that it has an academic component, a public component, advocacy, it exists in the public realm. It also exists in research and archives, and, just trying to make a case to all of these, sad PhD candidates who came to our session where they, and I think a number of them just kind of woke up to, well, I don't know if I can do this. I'm not a folklorist, but why isn't there something like this for me as, someone, who does critical thinking in 17th century, Irish literature or something like that. And our answer, I think, to these, to some of these students was, well, you can do it. You can do it. And you also have to ask your disciplinary organization, the MLA, to create more inroads for you into the public realm, right? And now MLA is doing that like crazy. They have, they got that message. I don't think they necessarily got it from us, but they got it partly from us. And they are trying to do more in that regard. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
Well, I have taken up a lot of your time. Thank you so much for talking to me today. This was really fun to do. This is what I find too. It's fun for me. So.
No, this was great. I had a great time. Thank you for inviting me, Andrea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Kay. Take care. I'll see you later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.